Well, let's go ahead and get started at this point. It's 4 o'clock, and as I said, I'm very pleased today to have the opportunity to talk with some of the founders of the Journal of Statistics Education. Really briefly, my name is Nick Horton from Amherst College. I'm the host and moderator today to the session. And this series is a way of kind of highlighting new interesting papers or kind of other things like this, look back into the history of the journal. As always, there's lots new going on. I just downloaded the list of latest articles. These are articles that have been accepted to the journal, but have not yet been queued up for an issue. And I'm pleased that these show up once they're in that, so people can start to kind of digest the wisdom and kind of work through things as they go. So some really interesting papers in that set. If you haven't looked, or if you haven't subscribed to the Taylor and Francis announcement that will tell you when these papers come on, I'd encourage you to do so on the website. We have an upcoming webinar. We've used a special time for this, 5 p.m. to make it a little bit more Australia friendly. It's still early in the morning, but we're excited to hear from Julia Polak and Di Cook, talking about their Do Data Competitions Improve Learning. Provocative and interesting paper there. As always, our webinars are recorded and posted with the slides. You can sign up for the November or see other information about webinars or look at the archive of recorded ones at the CauseWeb website. Other kinds of things happening. CAUSE, the Consortium for the Advancement of Undergraduate Statistics Education, makes these webinars possible. Next month, or early in the month, is the Electronic Undergraduate Statistics Research Conference. Again, sign up there. There's some exciting, great speakers, and definitely encourage people to participate. Send it to their students as well. Again, one of the big gaps here today is Jackie Dietz. Jackie was the founding editor of the Journal of Statistics Education. Many of us have had the opportunity to work very closely with Jackie over the years. Very sadly, she passed away this past year, and so unfortunately unable to be here for this. But I just, wanted to kind of mark and thank Jackie for all of her vision and energy, and really do miss her. So I'd like you to kind of do a thought experiment, if you would, and I'd like you to hearken back to the 1990s. A number of people here are, remember this personally. Some people in the audience may not have been born at that point. But the interweb was a thing, but it was a very different thing, very small, just getting started. This was a kind of a screenshot of what the Netscape browser looked like at that point. There wasn't a lot to look at, but we could see the potential in various ways. Gopher was a thing. And again, thanks to the University of Minnesota, that was my first kind of connection there of a way of navigating this. Someone asked me, was like Gopher like FTP? I said, yes, but more easy to use. And it allowed people to start to kind of take advantage of the various resources that were out there. And this is all kind of hauntingly familiar to me to some sense. I went back into the Internet Archive Wayback Machine and found the ASI website. The front page looked like this at the beginning of at the end of 1996. And it was mostly like chapters were getting into the act and setting up their own websites. But again, a very kind of different internet, a very different kind of world to some extent. And there were some other papers. There were a lot of people active at that time. I think it was a very exciting time in statistics and statistics education. David, George, and Joan and Bill Meeker's paper came out in the American Statistician in 1993. And in there is a quote that I gotta think George wrote this part, but obviously it's the four of you did the paper. Are we about to see a major national reemphasis on teaching? Bears will use indoor plumbing first. Them's fighting words. And I think that was a lot of the spirit that brought people together to kind of be thinking of, statistics, exciting time, lots of growth. How can we be being more effective in terms of our teaching? I have some other things here I'm going to go over very briefly, just to make sure if you haven't seen them, there's some gems in there. In the Heeding the Call for Change book that was put out by the MAA, I believe, there's a wonderful piece on teaching statistics that talked about the recommendations of the statistics focus group. And it went through different aspects of kind of where we are now and what we need to be doing to kind of help, in Jim Landwehr's words, of kind of like giving students the experience that they can have that really kind of mirror statistical practice. And I think what we're hearing would be mirroring data science practice. So one of the parts in there was to kind of establish new sections in journals. Mary Parker, another person who's been involved in so many different ways for such a long time, is that we need to be thinking about kind of creating opportunities for teachers to participate in conversations, that there need to be sections devoted to statistics education. And while saying that the Teacher's Corner of the American Statistician is interesting, it's a slightly different thing and not exactly the same thing of what's needed for statistics education. So there was a report there as well of Tim. And again, we have great to have Tim, the managing editor of the journal, about involving statistics teachers in email conferencing. And this set up a system using the technology of the day to allow there to be conversations which really weren't feasible beforehand. And that could be put together by the statistical education section. And Mary Parker singing the praises of this, that these, the enjoyment and kind of satisfaction of participating in these discussions. Again, this is all very matter of fact now, but back then didn't really exist. The founding editorial board I've listed here, and it's kind of a pretty amazing group of people, again, led by Jackie and Tim, but with Joan and Laurie Snell doing the teaching bits, Tim and Robin Locke doing data sets and stories, and a great set of associate editors, some of whom are still involved with the journal. That first issue came out in 1990. Three must be, because it's new car data from 1993, involved a interview with Fred Mosteller, and I'm pleased that we still have those interviews. An NSF conference report on activities in statistics education put together by George. Joan's paper, which is still one of the most viewed papers in the journal on teaching statistics using small group learning. A wonderful piece talking about the structure and philosophy about JSE that Tim wrote. Teaching bits, kind of an introduction to that section, as well as the introduction that Robin and Tim put together for data sets and stories. And again, trying to move us away from the 1970s cars that are still kind of one of the common examples in the 1993 new car data. Again, just as a resource, that paper from George talking about reconsidering statistics education really argued for the need for curricular resources. And to kind of talk about, this is so important since so many people who teach statistics have no formal training in statistics. Still a challenge for us. I think it's even harder now in a world of data science, and we still need to kind of provide those resources and materials in a way that will be accessible to people. Tim's paper on the structure and philosophy of the journal is also really worth reading. It describes some stuff that is like really dated, and some other parts that were remarkably prescient. And it's kind of really interesting to kind of go back. There's a historian in me, as I think in many of us, trying to think about those aspects of the founding and what it was really intended to be. We also have Tim to kind of talk about 30 year on now, this great with that. Dan Solomon, it's a great pleasure. I've not met Dan before, but the opportunity to kind of pull in a little bit of the CATS report from the Committee on Applied Theoretical Statistics at a symposium on modern interdisciplinary university statistics education. And in here, Dan declined John Tucker's invitation to talk about NC State, which I thought was noble. But instead he did some marketing for the Journal of Statistics Education, and in there talked about these same kind of motivations. And again, was really thought important, even at the highest level of the national academies, to be thinking about these aspects of pedagogy. There's other kind of resources in there. If you haven't read Jackie et al.'s piece on celebrating 20 years of the journal, there's also some really nice recollections and reflections in there that are available. But I really want to kind of turn things over at this point to our panelists. I'm going to kind of let you briefly introduce yourselves and your role, but if you could just share a little bit about yourselves and offer some reflections of that founding of the journal. And I'd like to go, in order, Joan, Jeff, Tim, and then Dan. So Joan, would you be willing to share a bit about yourself and offer some reflections?
Sure. Well, Nick, I'm so pleased that you organized this today and invited me to be part of it, because I retired 5 years ago and I've been very far away from the world of statistics education. So it was really a nice opportunity to go back and reflect and remember that time. I felt at that time that I was one of the lone people in my area who was focused on research on teaching and learning statistics. And I was working at the University of Minnesota. I didn't really have any colleagues who were doing work like me. I had recently discovered the SLOG group that included Jeff and Robin Locke and Tom Moore and George. And I was so excited to have colleagues who were passionately interested in teaching and learning of statistics. And then I got this letter out of the clear blue from Dan Solomon, who I didn't know, had never met, inviting me to come to this gathering at NC State to talk about the feasibility of creating a new journal that would focus on teaching statistics. And I was so honored to be invited. I went there knowing a few people. I had met Jeff, and I don't know if I'd even met Bob Hogue before, but I hadn't met Jackie or Don or Dan or Tim. And there we were. And I don't remember too much about the discussions I was sharing earlier. I remember the dinner at Dan's house and all of us sitting around and talking. And it was a wonderful group. It was charged with enthusiasm and excitement, and Dan was kind of at the center. It seemed to be his vision of starting this, and he wanted to know if we thought it was feasible, if we could work on it, and he was there to support us. So I think I left that meeting feeling very excited, very encouraged. I had volunteered to do this column Teaching Bits with Lori Snell, and I think I must have volunteered to write an article for that first issue, but I just remember it very fondly. And when we saw that first issue came out, it was thrilling, but boy, does it look different than the issue today. As you said, the technology was quite different back then, but just to have a free online journal dedicated to teaching statistics was quite a thrill. And I was so honored and excited to be part of that.
Great. Thanks, Joan. Jeff?
So I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the journal, although I've sort of handed stuff off to Nick. Nominally, I'm still editor-in-chief for another couple of months, but as of September 1st, Nick started getting the new submissions, which is when the workload really picks up. But I remember, so Jackie Dietz happens to be an Oberlin College alumna, and she had invited me down to NC State to give a talk earlier that year. The title of my talk was "The Best Ideas I Know for Teaching Statistics." I don't remember much about the talk other than having the audience do a living box plot, but I was invited back to this meeting about should we start a new journal. And I remember that there was mixed opinions about it. Some of us were enthusiastic. Some people thought, no, there are other outlets. We don't really need another journal. I also remember, I forget who the guy was, but there was someone there, I think from the math community, who was involved in an electronic journal, of which there were very few at the time. I remember him asking us, well, how many email messages did you all get yesterday? I had gotten like 3 in one day. It's like, wow. He had gotten something like 20. I said, is it possible to get 20 email messages in a single day? But he was a very technologically advanced kind of person, talking about what things can you do electronically as opposed to having a print journal. Because we were thinking about an electronic journal, which would not have been the first one, but among the first. And we're thinking, can you really do stuff only purely electronically? But there was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea of sharing teaching ideas more broadly. And I'll hand things off at that point.
Great. Thanks. Tim?
Yeah, I was working at NC State as the director of instructional computing, just for statistics. And the internet was just beginning. It was like, you felt like you had just discovered something. I think I had 2 notebooks that had every FTP site on the internet at that time. And I started a small mailing list for statistical education called EdStat-L. And that's where I started to meet people who are passionate about teaching statistics from all over the world. And they cared about helping each other. And their excitement led to me getting more excited and thinking there's more we can do here. And so I was there at NC State, and we Dan and I talked about what we could do, and Jackie. And so we thought, well, let's give it a try. But I remember we were all trying to think, what is this internet thing going to be? And we would look at history, like what happened when radio was invented, and what did people think it was going to happen, and what actually happened. And the same thing with TV, because we knew it was going to be something big, but it was really hard to predict what it was going to be. And I guess that's pretty obvious now. How could you predict what's happened? But I think there were some fundamentals that we didn't want to miss, and that's that we wanted to exploit the medium. Things you could do, like back then, video was kind of a controversial thought that you could have video on the internet. But the world just looked so different then. But we knew we could have animations, that was possible, and certainly we could have graphics. But and while we wanted to have high resolution graphics and animations and let people explore, maybe interactively even, we still wanted things to be available to teachers who weren't in places that had that kind of internet access. And so it was important to us that we stayed as open to people of all different kind of technologies when we would provide the base of the articles for that. So everything would be available in plain text, but we would also try to encourage authors to produce things that would exploit the medium. So those were the 2 things we were kind of trying to balance there. And looking at the journal now, I'm just so happy to see how far it's come, and that the technology has changed. And like you said, the appendix in the paper that I wrote about the structure of the journal, it's just, it would be embarrassing if it wasn't so fun that, the end of the story or the middle of the story, wherever we are, looks like it does today. And I think that's because the philosophy of the journal, we've kept to that core, the heart of trying to remain open and to encourage excellence in statistics education, and giving that as an outlet, and sharing our ideas and sharing our data sets, which make up the stories that help us teach.
Yeah, there's been so much that's been happening in terms of open educational resources and the like. But in 1992 or 1991, when this is first coming together, to be able to have that inclusivity and accessibility focus to it, again, that's the prescient part that I think has been remarkable, while still allowing people to bring in animations and other parts as a way of kind of augmenting and taking advantage of the electronic medium. I think that, Tim, has been really, really kind of effective. Dan, last but not least, we're so pleased to have you here today. And, I again, would love to kind of hear a little bit more of a little bit about yourself and just how you brought this amazing group together.
Well, I'm being given way too much credit for anything here, other than happening to have been the department head of the statistics department at NC State at the time. We were doing some strategic planning. That's the awful thing that department heads always do to their faculty and staff. And I had, of course, been interested in statistics education from my first appointment as an assistant professor, and being assigned to teach that huge class of graduate class in applied statistics for fearful non-majors. And that got me interested in looking at new ways and better ways to manage that. So we'd been doing some strategic planning, as I said, and saw the need for sharing information and doing research on how to improve the teaching of statistics. And so we came up with the idea in the department for establishing a journal on stat ed. Tim, of course, was the one who pushed for it to be electronic. And I hadn't thought about this until recently. When you announced this program, I was supportive of the idea of a journal, but I was also supportive of the idea, I think, from the beginning of it being electronic. And what I realized recently, that no doubt was at least in part because I had not long before finished a 5-year stint as editor of another international journal, a print journal, Biometrics, I was the editor of, in which I realized that we seemed to spend most of our time shipping paper manuscripts across the globe, from the author to me, and then from me to an associate editor, and then from an associate editor to the referees, and then back through that chain. And it could easily take over a year for a paper to get rejected, no less published. And that, no doubt, was part of what got me behind the idea to, yeah, let's see if we can go in that direction. The other comment I might make is I think it's fair to say that the founding of the journal in 1992, I think the first issue was January of '93. Issue is an old-fashioned term, I realize. That it was that founding that triggered in some ways some action from ASA long before the eventual adoption of the journal as an ASA publication, which didn't happen until 1999, I think it was January of 1999. And in particular, ASA set up it had a committee on, it had a publications committee. I think actually I was chair of that at the time. Mm-hmm. And they created a subcommittee on electronic communication. And this was in 93, 94 at about that time. And that report, the specific recommendations for what ASA should be doing. ASA didn't even have its own website at the time, or whatever the analog of website was, didn't have its own internet at the time. And that set of recommendations was presented to the ASA board in December of 1994. And that's the report that was summarized by Tim and others in the August '94 issue of the American Statistician that Nick, you had referred to in some of the earlier correspondence. So I think the journal can take some credit for actually moving ASA into the digital age as well.
Yeah, that's great to kind of get that broader context, because I think that fact that this has been something that's, early on was created, but then brought within the ASA fold has helped, I think, kind of have the messages resonate. And obviously with connections with cause and other things that we've been seeing.
Yeah, one other comment I might make, I think, Joan, I think the person you were referring to, and I'm gonna lose his name, but he was the editor of Postmodern Culture, which was one of the, if not the first electronic professional journal, which happened also to be, he was in the English department at NC State, happened to be here too. And that was another lucky break for us, I think.
I stumbled across a directory, a print directory of electronic resources that included some of those. And it was a pretty happening time of trying to kind of create those and make those things accessible. Jeff, you, I think, are the only person who's been kind of involved from the beginning and still involved. And I guess I'd be curious to get your thoughts, and then other panelists feel free to chime in on how the journal has changed since its founding, and have there been any parts there that have been surprising or otherwise noteworthy?
Yes, I'm not quite sure what to say about this. I was there at that early meeting, and I was an associate editor for a while, and then I was not for a while, and then I've been involved for several years now with my current role. As I think about early on, so some of the concern about starting the journal was that there would be like, I'd be taking a shower in the morning, have an idea, I go to my office, write it up and say, oh, I've got this cool idea. And that would be it, as opposed to actual evidence-based, serious, Joan was doing serious scholarship, other people were doing serious scholarship. Well, the first issue, we had some great papers, but then that was basically invited work. Would people out there send us serious papers, not just, here's a cool idea, I think, but did you really do this with your students? Did you modify it? Do you have evidence that it actually made a difference in what they learned? And there were some growing pains with that. We're still experiencing some of that, but that's been a real growth since those early days. And I think I'll stop there, let other people join in.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to interject that I had forgotten about that, but that was really important. I remember the first ones, we wanted everything to be so great when it started, and it was because, like you said, those were invited papers or invited panels sometimes. And it was a question whether we were going to be able to make it as a rigorously peer-reviewed journal. And I had totally forgotten about that until you mentioned it, because I started there and then have seen it from a distance since then. Joan, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I was just remembering that too, that in those early years, there were very few people that were even interested or willing to write about teaching statistics. So there was a very small number of authors, and the only other journal at the time was Teaching Statistics, the international journal out of the UK that was aimed primarily at K-12 education. So we didn't really have a model. I mean, we were creating it, and we wanted it to be scholarly. We wanted it to be rigorous. We wanted good reviews, but we had growing pains. It took a while, I think, to establish the kind of the set of authors, the set of reviewers, the readership. And it's really amazing to me now. I went and looked at the journal last night, having not looked at it for a while. And it's the scope is so much bigger. The authors, the scope is so much bigger in terms of content and also in terms of grade level and the expanding to data science. And that's, in addition to all the increased sophistication of the website and how nice it looks compared to those early versions that you got as didn't we get them as an email, Tim? When they be sent to us as an email?
Exactly. Yeah. You could request issues by email and it'd be sent to you in an email.
Yeah. So I think it's changed tremendously, and I'm very proud. And I think that statistics education is much better recognized now. And I'm glad that it's so freely accessible and so widely accessible, because as we know, there's still a tremendous need for good information to help us do a better job of teaching.
Yeah, and I think that point about the landscape is kind of interesting, Joan, that teaching statistics has been around for a while, but it's behind a paywall. And I think that is not a big deal for people who are well-resourced institutions or environments. I would imagine even at SAS, Tim, you have lots of journals that you can get through the workplace library and the like. But again, these questions of access and kind of, for people at community colleges or high schools or overseas, kind of allowing that access. And now we have the Statistical Education Research Journal, again, more focused on kind of research, but it's open access, the technology innovations and statistics education, and even newcomers like the Harvard Data Science Review that are all kind of open access in terms of their structure. Any other kind of thoughts about changes of the journal since its founding, or any surprises as you kind of ventured into this new world?
it's hard to be surprised when every day you're surprised by the technology changes and what that means in the way we communicate with each other. So huge surprises, I think there are just so many surprises. But like Joan said, we're just looking at the journal as it stands today, after having not looked at it for a while, it just looks great. I feel like there's something that we can all be proud of. Everyone who's made a contribution, and I know that's a lot of people.
Yeah, and we were talking before about how it became an official journal of the ASA in 1999. That was huge.
Yeah,
I remember Laurie Snell was involved in that, and he was going to meetings with Jackie to make the case to ASA, and we wanted so much to have the journal be associated with a very credible professional organization. And of course, for us, that was the ASA. And it took a long time, but I'm glad to see that it's still an official journal of the ASA. That means a lot, gives it a lot of credibility.
There was also a bit of hesitation from some quarters because it had been running independently on the back of Tim and other people at NC State. And now if it's taken over by ASA, will it still be the same open access treaty, this whole sort of renegade, we're doing this electronic journal thing, would that persist? And I remember Jackie polling us, asking, we're in these conversations, how do you feel about that? And some people saying, well, it's on the one hand, yes, we want this because we need a stable funding source to do this. And the recognition and support of ASA was great. But some caution as well, as another chapter was being written.
And again, I'm appreciative of the leadership from NC State. And I think there were some positive aspects that the department would say, well, we're going to be seen as the center of this thing, and it's kind of brings prestige to us. But nonetheless, there was a commitment there of both staff and time to kind of make things happen. And I worry that we're now at a point where there's not the same openness to be able to kind of create such things. I know that there's a lot of work now with other electronic journals and trying to figure out a path there that's going to be sustainable for associations and publishers and academic institutions. But trying to figure out models like this where there would be a sponsor that could be tied in, I think is one that worked really effectively, but I would now worry if it's going to be as feasible within the worlds we're now living in. I guess my last question before I turn things over to the audience questions, and again, we have some coming in, I would encourage those who are attending to kind of add your questions to the Q&A. As an incoming editor, you got some advice for me?
Publish good papers. No,
Yeah.
encourage people. So one thing I've noticed, and looking at journal submissions over the last several years, we get a fair number of papers that are rather narrowly focused, as one might expect, often coming from assistant professors and other younger people. We sometimes hear from more senior people as well. We said early on, we like Fred Mosteller is interviewed by David Moore and years of perspective, and that's great. More of that kind of thing. Senior people reflecting on big ideas and how they have changed how we practice statistics and therefore how we teach statistics and what we should be doing in the future. Not how can I tweak my intro course, although it always needs to be improved, but big ideas and hearing from established people it's in our aims and scope list, but we don't get those papers. So Nick, I encourage you to solicit those kind of papers because that's something that a wide readership would benefit from.
Yeah, that sounds good. I was going to say the same thing as Jeff, the focus on good quality. And one of the problems when I was first writing was finding good references, that we weren't just, as Jeff was saying, writing about here's an idea I had, but really trying to relate it to previous work, previous articles. How does it build on what we already know? And it was very hard long ago to find out what those relevant articles were, because there was no Journal of Statistics Education, and things could be published anywhere from the American Statistician to Teaching Statistics to journals specific to different disciplines. But I think there is still sometimes a resistance by authors to see what the foundational material is that their work is based on. And it's really important to make sure that the writers are accessing and referencing the relevant information, and the reviewers are paying attention to that too, and looking for examples of key references that may not be cited that should be. And you probably do this already, so it was just
I
my thought.
do have one comment. I hope it's not off the mark or inappropriate, and having been away from statistics education for a while, and the journal in particular for a while, and I'm not sure how the journal might help with this, but I think an important thing for the training, preparing of all scientists, including statisticians, is for us to do, those of us who are training or used to be training the next generation of scientists, including statisticians, to be sure to do a better job of giving them the tools with which to communicate their science, in our case, statistics, to the public, and engage the public and policymakers, and to instill in the next generation of statisticians and other scientists the sense that this is part of their professional responsibility. And how the journal might be able to encourage articles about how to get, quote, public science into the pages of the journal. I don't have a clue, but it seems to me at a sort of high level, that's an important thing for our community to be doing. As a final aside to that, if we're going to make that a professional responsibility, then we have to be changing the reward structures in the workplace to acknowledge the value of that kind of engaging with the public. I mean, we hear all about citizen science and such, but if that's not being rewarded in the workplace, then it's not going to go very far.
Yeah, I think, Dan, that point about the reward structure, and I think of the things that haven't changed so much in 30 years, I fear that the reward structure is still much the way it was, to our detriment as a society, and I think as a profession. I think the kind of the insights that you both are sharing about kind of the importance of communication, of seeing the big picture, of not being training the p-value police, but to kind of be really thinking about kind of making sense of data and extracting meaning from it, and making policy decisions and other decisions based on, in the face of variability, to use Jessica Utt's phraseology. I think we need to do a lot more about how we teach and approach those kinds of things. Again, I see them very much part of statistical practice. I think they would be included in a broad definition of data acumen, to use the kind of terminology of the national academies. But again, I think it's a broader sense of what it means to be teaching and thinking about statistics. And I think that's an area where we need to be doing some more work.
I was going to add something similar in spirit, which is, so we ask authors, give us some evidence that your students have learned from this different, like you're using randomization testing instead of normal theory. Okay, did your students actually learn as much or more? But the assessments tend to be rather narrow. On the final exam, my students can answer this question. I'm interested in, are you a better statistician? Students taking one, are you 5 years later, are you less likely to abuse p-values? And so, do you have are you better grounded as a person because of this innovative way that Nick taught his course to you? That's much harder to assess. That's what we should assess, because if my students can do a better job on the final exam and still 3 years later they're misusing hypothesis testing and so on, then I failed.
And some of this stuff came up, not wanting to plug last month's webinar. This is a great one. But the kind of collaboration videos that were put together that really raised these points with exactly the audience you're talking about, Dan, both on the future statisticians, but the scientists they're working with. But these are clearly areas where we want to continue to discuss. We do have a question that's come in from the floor. And you know, they agree with all the wonderful stories about how new this was in terms of content and mode of delivery. However, they wonder, and not a criticism, just an observation, did the journal live up to that potential in terms of animations, videos, nonlinear articles? It seems the journal ended up having articles looking a lot like papers in other journals. And is that still untapped potential or a lost opportunity? Tim, I think you're the most technically savvy of all of us. And I was a Unix sysadmin for about 7 years, but I'm gladly moving on. Tim, do you have any thoughts on that front? Again, looking back, looking forward?
I certainly don't see it as a lost opportunity, but I know I know a little bit about tech, and I know a little bit about being in class, you know, teaching. And it is really hard, or I found it very hard to be able to use these new methods of communication, which even now to me, the videos and animations are still a little new because I'm just not used to it. And to be that comfortable with the tool, to use it in the classroom, it's just a difficult thing to do. And I feel like as a teacher, that might be one of the reasons we don't see it so often, because it's a hard thing to use as a communication device. And also I've seen, on the other hand, I've seen technology used where it had no place at all. I mean, that you can spin your graph in 3 dimensions. Does that really help me understand the concept you're trying to get across? And so it's got to be the marriage of those two things, where that actually helps explain a topic and you understand the technology. And so I think it's still an untapped potential, is what I would say. And I'm glad that the person's asked it in that way, because I think we've got to learn still, even though it's been so many years, we've still got to learn how to use that technology. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we really know how to teach with it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting looking back at that. Soon after this period, when I was in grad school, I started working on a project using Macromedia Director to try to do some of these animations and the like. And it was hard to do some of the animations that were published early on. I would imagine a graduate student and a couple of months were involved for some of those. And it was pretty heavy duty programming. I put in the chat a link to the 2018 paper by Lee Fawcett on using interactive Shiny apps for kind of learning. And I think there's some transformative technologies in recent years that let mere mortals like me kind of program up some things that would be very flexible approaches. We've obviously got people on the webinar who've created applets and various things over the years. And I think there's more opportunity for us to really be highlighting this. And I think it's a valid point that it's been more thinking about the papers as PDFs or HTML as opposed to these other aspects. And that's a good point to kind of be thinking about. Any other comments or thoughts on that front? There's a question about whether there were any similar journals that appeared at or around the same time with a pedagogy focus that anyone is aware of. Were there similar experiments that you know of in physics or engineering or computer science?
I think physics was ahead of us. I feel like they had some, I don't know if it was electronic, but definitely they had a bigger base of research on teaching and learning physics. I think physics education was something I looked at a lot when I was first starting out in statistics education. And I don't know where engineering came in, but boy, they have become a very big area with a lot of projects and funding and visibility.
In large part, I think driven from the fact that the accreditation standards require it. And we can say you may be a fan of accreditation or not, but it certainly provided a lot of sense of that reward structure suddenly existed. because I think you could see that along the line. And I think people would get much more respect for the work they were doing in assessment, be it formative or summative, in those ways. And I think that's why engineering education has gotten so much respect and prestige. Any other thoughts?
Well, certainly there wasn't anything in statistics except for the British Journal. And then I think the next one was Surge, which came out in 2003. So from 93 to 2003, this was the only journal, really.
So we're coming close to the end of time. My final question is adapted from one from the from one of the attendees. How do you all see the journal evolving in the future? And what would you like to see if there are no research constraints? Or if you don't like that question, just some closing thoughts. But you know, any thoughts of how do you see it evolving in the future?
The expansion of adding data science as explicitly part of the journal is attracting some attention and getting us some interesting papers and giving me things to think about as a teacher, not just as editor. I see a lot of activity. We're getting more and more submissions as time goes on. And so the growth, and I'd like to see more international presence. The papers we get as submissions from overseas often are very narrowly focused and might have been a decent submission in 1985 or 1995, but in 2020, they're just not at all sort of cutting edge that other people would benefit from, which says there are people out there who should be learning some stuff that is not out there yet. And also there's sort of untapped potential in terms of a lot of really smart people out there doing stuff in other countries than the US, right? We're still very much a US oriented journal. I mean, ASA, of course, is in the ASA, but it's also, ASA is international, right? ESE should become more international, I would hope.
On that note, I remember there was some talk about cooperation between the JSE and the ISI, Statistics Education Group. And there were a lot of interest there, but I don't think there was the organization at that time, enough organized energy behind it to make a cooperative effort. But like you, I would really like to see a more international focus. Certainly that was some of my concern, was that the things that we can do in this country, we can't do everywhere. And that's one reason I was so glad to have the articles made accessible to other countries. I'd sure like to see papers coming in from other countries as well.
And I guess I have a question for Jeff as the current editor. How many submissions or articles do you see coming in from K-12 education or focused on K-12 education?
So there are a fair number of those. Could I give you a number? Is it, do we get maybe 20 in the past year?
Okay.
Something on that. That's a bit of a guess because those go to Jenny Green now. It's been handling K-12, but it's a fair number, and I think a growing number.
That's great.
And we're seeing there's incredible activity right now in, like, you know, just as one example, the AI for K-12 initiative is kind of really proposed an entire framework for thinking about, you know, machine learning and artificial intelligence, starting in elementary, middle school, later on. We have some of the work that's just coming out now that Joe Bowler and Rob Gould have been putting together. Again, thinking about what data science looks like at K-12. And I think these are areas where, unfortunately, you know, we haven't had as much of a presence as there has been in some other. And I think this is an area where there could be great growth in some of those ways. I will make my last question now. And so one of the attendees asks, as someone who is just beginning my journey really focused on STEM education research, do you have any advice you would give to junior scholars just getting started?
I would say try to find some people to collaborate with. I think collaborations is the best way to do good research, to have people that you can talk to. Of course, you can Zoom, you can email, they can be anywhere in the world, but to be able to talk and collaborate and argue and critique, I think makes stronger research and better written papers. And long ago in cause, we started cooperative research groups, and we found that to be a very effective way of getting new researchers connected and starting productive careers. So unfortunately, I don't think we have that initiative anymore, but I would really encourage trying to find people who are interested in some of the same questions and start talking to each other and see if there's some ways that you can collaborate together.
And be aware of the reward structure in your world.
Spoken by a department chair and dean.
And again, that's I think where work is needed to kind of make those more modern. Lance Waller has a great piece that appeared in PJ and the American Statistician, talking about the reward structure for data science contributions, including data sets, software, other kinds of infrastructure that are part of the broader science that actually make changes. Joan, I've included a link in the chat for the research satellite that met most recently on July 6th. It was fabulously structured. Matt Beckman from Penn State, my apologies, and your student Laura Lee led a group to really try to think about and that aspect of helping people find collaborators was a big part of that.
Yeah, Matt was my student too.
I'm sorry,
That's okay.
Forgot that.
Matt and Laura.
all roads lead to Dinkytown. Any closing thoughts from you four? As I said, I've so appreciated the chance to kind of hear your recollections and to kind of bring some other things. I'm left with some other reading to be doing, but do you have any kind of closing thoughts before I turn things off?
If I may have one, having said I didn't want to be a panelist, but one final comment that I think relates to the earlier one that I made. We tend to think about education as something that goes on in a classroom. And I think there's opportunity, and again, I haven't been looking at the journal recently, to engage and partner with the informal education community. That's a very large collection of scholars. I don't know if we interact with well. There's a substantial literature on, for example, education that goes on in a museum, for example, and important, currently really important topics like how do we engage a broader public in informal settings, informal education settings like a museum. I would hope that the journal would figure out how to solicit articles that touch on that connection of informal science and engage with that community.
That's great advice. I know there's a lot of work in there, and that's an area NSF has targeted for because there's a lot of things happening in very different settings, and statistics should be part of those conversations, statistics and data science. Tim, Jeff, Joan, any closing words?
I'll just say that I'm struck by the fact that, in education, it's all volunteer stuff, right? None of us, I don't get paid to be an editor. The associate editors aren't paid, the referees. It's all just a whole bunch of volunteers working together. I mean, in a sense, I'm competing against another school in a certain sense, right? Admissions time and so on. But no, we're sharing our best ideas and putting in time late at night doing all this volunteer work. And it's a army of people out there who are doing all this work that then leads to the journal being viable. And that's, I think, just a great thing to celebrate.
Educators are the best. I just had to say. Go ahead, Joan. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I wanted to thank Dan for inviting me to that first meeting. And I wanted to thank Tim for your work as co-editor. You were co-editor, right, at the beginning. And Jeff for your work as editor, and Nick for your work as editor to be or current and future, because as Jeff said, it's a lot of work and it's unpaid, but it's extremely valuable and it's contributed so much, I think, to our field. So just want to thank all of you for what you've done and what you're doing.
Well, I also want to give a kind of a virtual thanks to you all for your commitment to kind of make the journal what it is. And again, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and close off the recording, the notes, the slides, and the recording will be made available. And looking forward to November's webinar that Lee will be moderating. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.